Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
I know almost after what it's 1 o'clock, but in Chicago it's still 4 a.m. Well, this next hour I'm going to be talking about nature or nurture. I think that there's many questions right now that we think about when we think about the issue of homosexuality, and a lot of times science is brought into the conversation and people say, well, I'm born gay, this is just the way I am. Science has proven that people are born gay, and yet, what does science say? And so I think it's important for us to see, to look at what science really says, and then what theology, what the Bible says. So this next hour I want to kind of answer that question, or look at the question of, is it biology, or is it environment, is it nature, or nurture? But ultimately, I think what's most important is to be careful not to try to get involved in debates with people and arguments with people. Because really, at the end of the day, the most important thing is the gospel. And we need to win people to Christ, not through debates, and not through good arguments, and not through more information, but it's really through winning them through having a compassionate heart for those people in the gay community, and seeing that a lot of times that even though they might have a misunderstanding, but that misunderstanding is really, I think, not from their own fault, but it's really just from their being deceived by the world and being deceived by the enemy. So it's interesting, those of you guys that heard my story, I had gone to dental school for many years, had done 4 years of pre-med and then 4 years of dental school, and never finished. So often, Chinese people, they're like, oh, 你会不会回去拿你的牙医博士? But are you going to go back and are you going to get your doctorates? You've gone so many years of school, it's like you're wasting all that time. But the reality is, God never really wastes things. I mean, it might take years for you to realize why you went through something. But it's interesting to see how, even through all of my education in the health sciences and medicine and pharmacology and in anatomy and genetics and histology and pathology, I really realized that I'm able to use some of that I've learned and incorporate that into this ministry on this issue of homosexuality, because science is often used, and I believe misused, in the conversation on homosexuality. So it's amazing how God can redeem our past and use it for His good. So because of my past in the health sciences, I try to take some of these studies on sexuality and make it more understandable for lay people, maybe people who aren't as scientifically gifted. But I'm probably, Chinese, where we could probably understand that. But usually when I speak to Caucasian congregations, I need to really make it simple for them. But I think many of you guys will be able to understand this. I have notes, and I think Pastor Lenny printed out these notes. If you would like a digital copy of my notes, you can find that here, and I think this is a shortened URL and a QR code. So there's many studies on the issue of homosexuality. Etiology of homosexuality, that's kind of a fancy way, etiology of saying causation. Sometimes it's used in the conversation about diseases, but I don't see homosexuality as necessarily a disease, but I just use this word just to see what are some possible causative factors of homosexuality. There's two main groups, looking at either biology or an environment. So I want us to look at some of the biological studies on the issue of homosexuality. And among those, there's many studies that have been done on the issue of homosexuality, and still many more that are in process today. But and we can't cover them all, but I want to touch on some of the main ones that are often used and quoted. The first group of studies look at twin studies. And why would you want to study twins? Why would we want to study twins? What do they share? Same genetic, usually the same characteristics, pretty much. I mean, but they say that they share the identical genes. So if you want to study whether a trait has some genetic component, most often you would study twins. So you look at identical twins, fraternal twins, and then siblings. So identical twins, they share exactly the same genes. Fraternal twins, they share up to about 50% same genes, and then siblings, around the same or maybe even a little less than that. So study twins regarding homosexuality. The first study that was done by Bailey and Pollard in 1991. And they were looking at identical twins and fraternal twins. And what they looked at was when one identical twin was gay, what is the percent that the other identical twin was gay as well? Well, what he found was that it was 52%. When one identical twin was gay, the other one was gay as well. So, and many of us, we think, wow, that's a pretty high percentage rate. But if we're trying to prove that once a certain trait is 100, purely genetic, then what would this percentage need to be? 100%. So, though 52%, according to this study, that's pretty high, but at least we can say that there's other factors, if this is true, that there's other factors that would play into it other than genetics. Because if it's 100% genetic, then this percentage would need to be 100% or at least close to it, like 99%, 98%. But 52, that's not close to 100%. What was interesting about this one study was not only was it not 100%, but where they got people to participate in the study was strictly from gay magazines. So they advertised in gay magazines, they put up posters in the Chicago and the gay part of the neighborhood. So do you think those results, these results, 52%, would be representative of the population in Chicago or even here in America? No. So would this number be lower than normal or higher than normal? Higher than normal. Why? Because they have a biased applicant pool, because they weren't pulling a representative sample from the population. So Bailey realized this mistake and he did another study. Bailey done in Martin, I guess he fired Pollard. And he did another study in 2000, and he studied Australian twins. And what he found was that the concordance rate is when, what's the percentage when both both twins are gay, is 30% when both twins were gay. However, this study could not be replicated. In essence, anytime a scientist does a study and finds some results, for it to be reputable, another scientist in another situation should be able to do the same study and get the same or very similar results. That's just called, you could replicate the results. Well, no one has since, and people have tried to do this study and have not found the same results. Remember this number, 52% and 30%? What were some other numbers? Bierman and Bruckner did this study in 2002. 6.7 was the concordance rate when both identical twins were gay. Langstrom, Raman, Kohlstrom, and Lichtenstein in Sweden did a study in 2008. And this was the largest twin study of same-sex sexual behavior attempted so far. They looked at 3,826 twins. What they were looking at, though, was not concordance rate. Remember, concordance rate is what's the percentage when both twins are gay? What they were looking at was something a little different. And it was a little interesting to read, a little more difficult to read. They were looking at what are possible percentage of these different factors: genetics, shared environment, and an individual specific environment. Well, what they found, what they printed as their results was that genetics they believed to be 34 to 39%. Shared environment for men they believed was 0%. And shared environment they would say would be familial, according to them. And then individual specific environment, which would be social and biological, such as hormonal. This is something that we need to note as well. Sometimes scientists, they include within environment prenatal hormonal influence. And because scientists have shown that when twins are in the mother's stomach, not the stomach, but the womb, depending on where the twin is, they can get either more hormone or less hormone. Sometimes twins, they don't share the same amniotic sac. They have their own individual stack, and so then they can have, different levels of hormones. So though they may have the exact same genes, their hormones may be different. So sometimes scientists put the prenatal hormonal environment here. For me, I think that's biological, and I like to separate biological from environmental. For me, environmental is more familial, sociological, psychological, but you have to be careful when you read these studies what they're talking about. So among females, they believe that genetics was 18 to 19%. Shared environment was about 16 to 17%. And an individual-specific environment was 64 to 66%. So what does all that mean? Well, these scientists did, in the study, they're quoted to say this: although wide confidence intervals, and I'll explain to you what is wide confidence intervals in just a moment, suggest cautious interpretation, the results are consistent with moderate, primarily genetic, familial effects, and moderate to large effects of the non-shared environment. So they're saying that it's genetic, familial, and non-shared social and biological effects. But what do they mean by this wide confidence interval? Wide confidence interval is basically, another way of saying confidence interval is saying margin of error. So, like, this is an election year, and a lot of people do surveys and look at, well, how many people support Obama? How many people support Romney? And if you read within the fine line, you see that there is a margin of error, plus or minus, usually a few percentage points, right? When you see something that's plus or minus 10%, what do you think about that study? Not that accurate. What do you think about a study that's plus or minus 20%? I mean, it's even worse, right? I mean, that's a huge margin there. And when you say plus or minus 20%, it's just not a total of 20. It's 20 above and 20 below, which is a range of 40%. Well, guess what the margin of error for this study was? 0 to 59%. I mean, that's like plus or minus 30%. Shared environment is 46%. That's plus or minus 23%. Individual specific environment, that's 41 to 85%. That's plus or minus 20%. So I mean, as you can see, what do you think about those confidence intervals? Are those pretty small or pretty big? Or I would say huge. I mean, like, you could drive a Mack truck through that wide confidence interval. I mean, it is enormous. So I'm almost surprised why they even published, or were able to publish this. Yes?
So relative to other, it's more of a psychological tool and evaluation, right? That's kind of the experiment that they're doing. Okay, so for other similar studies, they also get that large confidence interval?
Well, I mean,
for other similar studies.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, if it was me and if I got such a wide confidence interval, I would have a hard time even guesstimating what you know what I mean? Because, if you're going to come to any type of conclusion, you have to have a fairly narrow wide confidence to come to a conclusion. When your confidence intervals are so wide, you can't really come to a conclusion. So in a sense, when you do a study like this and the numbers are just all over the place, how can you come to any conclusion? So that's my point. That this was the first study ever done, from this. So I'm glad they were honest about the fact that their confidence intervals were really wide. I would have added not just wide confidence intervals, but very wide confidence intervals. Because look at that, that's 0 to 59%. But there's very few studies. This is the first study. This was done in 2008, and of this size and of this nature. But I would be extremely hesitant to even give those numbers that they gave here, because really what this is more median. But how can you do a median when there's such an enormous spread? Because it's really not, unless you get things down to a very, very narrow, wide confidence interval, then I think you could be pretty accurate to say this is pretty close to what the mean is. And also, I have another question, because if you look at the shared environment here, they say 0 to 46, but remember among men, what did they say? They came down with 0. How in the world? I mean, that just scientifically doesn't make sense. I mean, I don't know any of you guys are statisticians or have done these type of studies, but it just doesn't compute. You know what I mean? I don't know how they came up with this, because if they're going to give a confidence interval of 0 to 46, you can't come up with a 0 here. The only way you can come up with a 0 is if this shared environment was 0. Does that make sense? So, or it would need to be negative something, which you can't have a negative. But you're right. It's always good to see what are other studies like. Is it the same? Unfortunately, this is one of the first of this type of study. But what I wanted to know was concordance rate. Remember the other tests? 52% concordance rate when, what was the percentage when one twin was gay, the other twin was gay, and then 30% when one twin was gay, and then the other one was 6%. Well, I wanted to know in this study what was the concordance rate, and and they didn't publish that. I don't know why they didn't publish that, because I think that would have been, like you say, we want to look and compare it to other studies, because all the other studies, even though this might have been new, it would have been good to at least compare it to all the other studies that were done on twins, on homosexual, on the gay identity or homosexuality, but they didn't even publish or print that number. And so I had to go in there and look at the numbers myself and compute it. And what I found was that 7 out of 71 pairs of MZ, MZ stands for monozygote, which is identical twin, or 26 out of 214 pairs of female identical twins had same-sex partners. So that's 10% males and 20% males. Close to 52%? Is that close to 30%? I mean, you know, maybe it's closer to the other 6%. And you might be wondering, why did it say same-sex partners here? Well, the reason why they didn't ask in the questionnaire that the twins filled out, are you gay, was they wanted to try to make this study as unbiased as possible. If you're familiar with studies, like people who study pharmacology and drugs that are coming out, you've heard of blind studies, right? Or double blind. Blind is when the patient himself or herself does not know whether they're taking the actual medicine or they're taking a placebo or a sugar pill. And so then you compare those two. A double blind would be what? The researcher doesn't know either. So if I'm the doctor, I don't know if this patient is actually taking the real medication or the placebo. Or sometimes it could maybe not necessarily be a placebo, but another brand of the same medication, so at least you can compare. So I don't know until the end of the day. Some other researcher looks at the data and they know which patient took which drug. So you always want to make the study as unbiased as possible, and if these scientists put it in the questionnaire, are you gay, they were afraid that that might skew the results, and that might make it really obvious that this is a study on homosexuality and twins. So among a bunch of other questions, they kind of put in there just 1 or 2 questions. How many times, or have you ever had a same-sex partner? So the positive is that they worded it in a way that they tried to make it as unbiased as possible, because they learned from Bailey and Pollard. Remember, that study was very unbiased, or I mean very biased, and also from other studies. So they tried to make this as unbiased as possible. So that's good. But the downside of that is when they tried to make it unbiased and vague, then your results are not going to be extremely accurate, because I just want to know who is gay and who is not gay, because in these numbers, you could have people who are bisexual. In these numbers, you could have people maybe who are experimented, and they're not really gay. They maybe, especially today when you have a lot of girls that go off to college, they kind of experiment around as lesbians, but they're, or with another woman, but they don't really, they say, I'm not really gay, I'm really straight. So we don't really know. So I even think that these numbers are a little higher than normal, because included would be bisexuals, included would be people who experimented, and also people who maybe even got abused sexually, but they're not necessarily gay. Does that make sense? So in conclusion, we find that Langstrom, this study, they found that both environment and biology play roles, that it is a combination of genetics, hormones, familial, sociological factors that play into this. Well, let's look at another group of studies on biology, and that's in brain structure. Simon LeVay in 1991 studied the hypothalamus, because that's believed to be where animals regulate their sexual behavior. They studied cadavers, 19 gay men that died of AIDS, then 16 presumed heterosexual men, and I kind of added this presumed in here because we don't really know whether they're heterosexual or not. I mean, it's kind of hard to ask a cadaver, are you gay? Because they're not going to answer you. And also 16 presumed heterosexual women. Simon LeVay studied the different neural groups, INAH 1, 2, 3, and 4, and what he found that the INAH3 group of neurons appeared to be twice as big in the presumed heterosexual male group as in the gay male group. So that was kind of an interesting study, but remember, for a study to be reputable, it needs to be replicated. So someone tried to replicate this study, and they couldn't. They found no statistical significance between the size of the INAH3 group, between the heterosexual group and the homosexual group. Simon LeVay himself was quoted, and this study is often quoted a lot, the hypothalamus. And his conclusion is, it's important to stress what I did not find. I did not prove that homosexuality is genetic or find a genetic cause for being gay. I didn't show that gay men are born that way, the most important common mistake made in interpreting my work. Nor did I locate a gay center in the brain. Oftentimes people say, we found the gay center of the brain. Since I look at adult brains, we don't know if the differences I found were there at birth or if they appeared later. So, we see that even Simon LeVay, said, I might have seen this difference, but we don't know if those changes came at birth or later on in life, because a lot of these people, they died of AIDS. So maybe it was part of the medication that they took, or maybe it was part of, we don't really know what caused that. Another group of studies are looking at chromosomes. Hammer, Hu, Magnuson, and Patitucci in 1993, they looked at 76 gay brothers and their families. And what was interesting was that on the maternal side, they found that there was more preponderance of homosexuality on the mother's side. And so therefore, they studied the X chromosome of gay men. Why? Because you have in men the X chromosome and the Y chromosome. And what chromosome would you get from your mom? The X chromosome. You get the Y chromosome from your father. So therefore, they studied the X chromosome in gay men, and what they found was that in 83% of gay men, they had a similar allele or a portion of the distal region of the X chromosome, the XQ28. Well, what is important to note as well is that this was popularly and inaccurately dubbed the gay gene by media. I don't know if any of you guys remember this, but back in 1993 and 1994, Time magazine published on their cover. Does anyone remember that? The gay gene. Yeah, I remember that. I mean, I was 23, 24 years old, and it was said, we found the gay gene. Well, this is what Hammer said. He's gay himself, and he said, environmental factors play a role. He even says that. It's not just a gay gene that makes a person gay. There is not a single master gene that makes people gay. I don't think we'll ever be able to predict who will be gay. Bailey, remember from Bailey and Pollard? He tried, and there was no control group as well. Remember I was talking about the studying some drugs, well, you need to have a control group, someone who takes the drug and another group who doesn't take the drug, whether it is a placebo or whether it is another type of, another brand of drug. And so therefore you can control. And so that therefore you can compare the two. Well, Hammer did not have a control group. And why would that be significant? Why do you want to have a control group? So you can compare. So what would be the control group? If he's studying gay men, what would be the control group? Straight men. Men that aren't gay. And what would happen if he found that in straight men, they also had that same distal region of the XQ28, the same? What would that do with the results? Negated. I mean, you wouldn't find anything. All you've proven is that all men have this same trait. So, it's important that to see that he did not have a control group. Well, others tried to replicate this study, and they couldn't. Bailey and others couldn't replicate it. McKnight and Malcolm in 2000, they also could not. They could not find the same, the common distal region of the XQ28 chromosome in other men. So, those are some of the biological studies that are often cited, and of course I kind of critiqued them as we went. But I'm also going to talk about some environmental studies, and also I'm also going to critique some of those after I present them all. Studies on environment. We looked at twins. Remember the Langstrom study? Well, he believed that genetics and environment play into the influence of same-sex behavior. Kendler, Thornton, Gilman, and Kessler in 2000 studied American twins, and they believed that familial factors influence sexual orientation. Here are some other studies on familial factors. A lot of these are older ones, so they may not have the kind of high test scrutiny that we have today. But we see that Justin Bieber did a study here as well. And then Lung and Chu, this is interesting. Taiwan did a study. Do you guys know that? 275 Taiwanese military were studied, and they believed that paternal protection and maternal care were determined to be the main vulnerability factors in the development of homosexual males. Just a note on Taiwan, and since I know a lot of people are here from Taiwan, did you guys know that Taipei is kind of like the San Francisco of Asia? Did you guys know that?
Nope.
Yeah. Taipei is the people from Korea, Japan, all over Asia go to Taipei for, they have an enormous gay pride parade, huge. And so Taipei is known to be like the place to go for the gay bars, the gay clubs. So just a side note. And it's interesting too because we see here in the US, for some reason, there's more gay men that are more vocal and more in the mainstream. Here in the U.S., when we think about homosexuality, even though right now we have Ellen and who else? Ellen and Lady Gaga, Rosie O'Donnell. Yeah, she's kind of last year, but yeah, Rosie O'Donnell, Ellen. But generally, we seem to kind of come across more gay men than gay women. I don't know if there's necessarily more, but in Taiwan, there's just lots of women. Lesbians are more vocal or more prevalent. I don't know if it's prevalent, but it's more. You see more of them. I think they call them Lala, right? Is that what they call it in Chinese? Lala, yeah. I learned some Chinese when I went to Taipei. Lala and 出柜子. Where was I? Taiwan. Some other studies that were done: childhood gender nonconformity, fraternal birth order, and studying urban environment plus the rural environment. Well, like I said, I critique the biological studies, but I also want to look at these studies on family and psychology and sociology as well, because I think that some of these studies may not be as accurate as we think, because oftentimes within the church, we have this tendency to put more weight upon environment, that we think, oh, it must be environment that causes homosexuality. Well, how you're raised, or having an absentee father or a dominant mother, that must be how people are gay. Well, there's some weaknesses of the environmental studies. Why? Because often they confuse correlation with causation. Correlation with causation. What is causation? Well, causation, I think many of you guys know, it's when one factor or a group of factors brings about some other effect, some other trait. Clear cause and effect. Correlation is when there's some type of relationship between these two variables, where it could be positive when one goes up, the other one goes up, or it could be negative when one goes up, the other one goes down. Okay, that's correlation. We don't know what type of correlation that is. It could be causal, it could be effectual, it could be indirect, or it could be completely coincidental. So that's more correlation, and we need to be clear that correlation is not the same thing as causation. Let me give you guys an example. We're close, we're in New York. There was actually a study that was done many, many years ago that studied how when there was a greater consumption of ice cream, murder rates also went up.
What?
Yeah. The greater consumption of ice cream, they noted that there were greater murders. This is a fact. Is that causation or is that correlation? It's obviously correlation, right? You don't need ice cream then to kill people more. But, so is that cause, effect, indirect, or coincidental? It's incidental, or it could be indirect, meaning there's some other factor that the two are related to. Anyone think what that third factor might be? It's hot. It's the summer. What happens during the summer? People are going to eat more ice cream. But what else happens during the summer? More crimes, the gangbangers are out, the murderers come out of hibernation, so we find greater incidence of murder as there is also greater consumption of ice cream. So that's a positive correlation. When one goes up, the other goes up, but it's not cause or effect. It's indirect, it could also be completely coincidental, but it makes sense that it's indirect because it's summer. So most of the studies on environment actually look more at correlation than they do causation. You see, because correlation is very easy to prove. All you have to see is if one goes up, does the other one go up? That's very, very easy. However, causation is much harder to prove. Causation, you have to have a control group. You have to have unbiased representative sampling. You need to be able to have probably a large group that you're studying, and maybe a longitudinal, meaning you do the study over time, maybe over 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, and that's hard to do. So causation is certainly harder to prove. And that's why when sometimes we say, oh, well, this friend of mine, he must have, he's gay, so he must have had a father who wasn't home, or he was raised by his mother. For us to put such a clear link to absentee father and dominant mother, I think we're confusing causation with correlation. And this is my reasoning. If homosexuality is caused by an absentee father or a dominant mother, then we should be able to find a higher percentage of homosexuality within communities where that is almost the norm, such as urban communities, right? I mean, in the inner city, where you have some of the kids, they don't even know their father. Some of them never even met their father. And they're raised strictly by their mother, or by their sisters, or by their aunts. So in those communities, in the inner city communities, we should find a large percentage of homosexuality. But we don't. But instead, what do we find? We find a high percentage of drug use, high percentage of gangs, high percentage of alcohol abuse, maybe promiscuity, heterosexual promiscuity, teenage pregnancy. So what we do find is that it's not that having an absentee father or mother is the cause of homosexuality. That's just an unhealthy environment to raise children. Amen? I mean, that's an easy one. And when you have that unhealthy environment, to raise children, what happens to your children? They're more susceptible to all these different struggles and sins that pull us away from God's ways. That I think God put in our hearts to see that this is rebellion and this is not. So that's why I think some of these environmental studies are studying more correlation than causation. Do I think that having an absentee father and a dominant mother has maybe some influence? I think it can maybe make things worse. It doesn't help things for certain. But it's hard. I don't think it would be accurate to say that that is the cause, that is why someone is gay. You see the difference? There's a big difference there. Well, just as I critique the environment, I kind of critique the biological as I went, but I also want to say a few more things regarding biological, because sometimes we are afraid to say that there might be some biological link or factor or component to the issue of homosexuality, because then we think, well, aren't we saying that people are born gay? The problem is that when we say that someone is born gay, that it's innate, that's not the same thing as saying that there's a biological component. Because when we say that someone is born gay, we're saying that is all biological, right? It needs to be pretty much set at birth. That within the womb, either it's genetic or it's hormones or whatever, it's completely biological. So when the baby is born, that baby is gay, and it can't be changed. It's innate and fixed at birth. But to say that it's biological, to say that there's a biological component, that means that there's other components, such as an environment. And so we need to be clear that when people say, oh, born gay, well, that's not the same thing as saying that there could be a biological component. Well, if we're not born gay, then people say, well, how about, did people choose? Then it must have been a choice. Both are wrong. It's not born gay, and it's not a choice either. Because I've really yet to meet anyone who chose to have gay feelings. I didn't wake up one day and say, oh, I want to have these feelings. That's not how it happens. Where the choice comes in, though, is we choose to respond to those feelings. Just like us. Did any of us choose to be tempted by sin? Did any of us choose to have a sinful nature? Did anyone of us choose to come from Adam and Eve? No. We didn't choose that, but where does the choice come in? We choose to respond to those feelings, to those temptations. So that's where the choice comes in. But when you're not a Christian, you can't separate the two. So I don't believe that it's born gay, even though I think there's biological components, as there are also environmental components. But it's not a choice either. So I think we build up a false dichotomy that it's either born gay or choice. Both aren't right. It's actually more complex than that it's biological and environmental influences. Another part of the problem with these biological studies is that there is no empirical test for homosexuality. There's no MRI, there's no blood test, there's no CT scan, there's no X-ray, there's no objective, there's no phenotype for homosexuality. The only way that we know that whether someone is gay is if they actually tell us, right? We shouldn't go and say, oh, you look gay, so you must be gay. No, it's, if they tell us they're gay, then we realize that they are. And so when people say, oh yeah, we've already proven that people are born gay, the problem with that is that we haven't shown that people are born gay. We haven't shown that that this has been set at birth. Because if we have, then we should be able to go into a clinic of newborn babies, and instead of picking out the boy babies and the gay babies, we should be able to pick out the boy babies and girl babies. We should be able to pick out the gay babies and the straight babies. But we can't. If we have proven that people are born gay, then instead of a doctor giving birth to a baby and saying, oh, look, it's a boy, it's a girl, we should be able to say, it's gay, it's straight. But, obviously we can't do that. So, like I said, I think it is a combination of different factors. And so science is pointing to that it's different factors. But what does God say? What does our theology say? So let's look at that now. we've looked at some of the science, now let's look at theology. And more importantly, if we believe homosexuality is part of our sinful nature, then we have to have a proper understanding of the doctrine of sin. Psalm 51:5 says that, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." So we're all born with a sinful nature, and so, none of us chose to have that, but we all have that sinful nature. But does that mean then that we are born, a sinner, or does that even mean that we're born gay? Well, no, because I believe all of us are born with the predisposition, which means kind of a leaning toward a certain sin. All of us, I think, were. Some of us maybe were born with a predisposition toward jealousy. Maybe some of us were born with a predisposition toward pride. Some of us might be born with a predisposition toward selfishness, or overeating, or liking chocolate, whatever it is, anything. And so I think some people might be born with a predisposition toward homosexuality. Let me give you an example. Let's take alcoholism. Almost everyone, we kind of have no problems with saying that alcoholism has some genetic factors that play into the development of alcoholism. Here's a quote. "Genetic factors appear to play a significant role in alcoholism and may account for about half of the total risk of alcoholism. But to develop alcoholism, other factors usually come into play, including biology, genetics, culture, and psychology." Sound familiar? Just like, I think, sexuality. I think it's many different factors. Genes could play into it, biology, culture, psychology, sociology, how we're raised. So does that automatically then make someone an alcoholic at birth? Like, let's say I have 2 alcoholic parents. Am I automatically an alcoholic? No. I probably at birth might have a higher percentage of becoming an alcoholic than other people who are born to non-alcoholic parents. But when does that person become an alcoholic? After they start drinking, and they never stop drinking. They make the wrong friends, how they're raised, the environment, sociological. So, we see that there's probably many different factors that play into it, not just one. It's even thought that obesity might have some biological factors and genetic factors, violence maybe even. Even some studies were done on infidelity. So, I think that it could be, many factors that play into it, that we also need to be clear that just because there could be some biological component, it doesn't make something morally permissible. Like, you can't say, well, okay, I have this in my genes, so I can't help it. For example, mass murderers. They studied their brains, and guess what? Their brains are a little different than the rest of us. Aren't you happy about that? That they're a little different than the rest of us. So should we then just empty out all the prisons? They can't help it. Of course not. No matter what our biology or genes say or do or point us toward, we still are responsible for our actions. Another example. Many of you guys at one time were a teenager. Teenage years, you have your hormones going through your body and, biology, you could just say, well, I can't help it. This is just the way I am. I'm made this way. No, we are still responsible for our actions, even though our biology might be one way or another. So biology doesn't make something morally permissible or even determinative. So I believe that homosexuality has multiple factors and components, including both some that are biological and some that are environmental. That it's not either or. So when we ask the question, is it nature or nurture, I think we're asking the wrong question. That it's not nature or nurture, it's nature and nurture. It's both and. Because I think our theology agrees with that, and science has shown this as well. Here's a quote from the American Psychological Association. And it says, "Some people believe that sexual orientation is innate and fixed, however sexual orientation develops across a person's lifetime. And many of you guys might know this organization. Is that a conservative organization? It's a pretty non-conservative, let's say, organization. And they're also not Christian. But as you see, they believe that it's a combination of, that it develops across a person's lifetime. So regardless of what some people believe, and I might add Oprah or Lady Gaga, this scientific organization says that it develops across a person's lifetime. Here's another organization by the American Psychological Association. It says there's no consensus among scientists about the exact reasons an individual develops heterosexual, bisexual, gay, or lesbian orientation. Although much research has examined the possible genetic, hormonal, developmental, social, cultural influences on sexual orientation, no findings have emerged that permit scientists to conclude that sexual orientation is determined by any factor or factors. Many think that nature and nurture both play complex roles. This is the American Academy of Pediatrics, another very liberal organization. Sexual orientation probably is not determined by any one factor, but by a combination of genetic, hormonal, and environmental influences. And I love this quote because this is by the Association of Gay and Lesbian Psychiatrists. No one knows what causes heterosexuality, homosexuality, or bisexuality. There is a renewed interest in searching for biological etiologies or causes for homosexuality. However, to date, there are no replicated scientific studies supporting any specific biological etiology for homosexuality. And then these two quotes are from a professor at Northwestern and University of Illinois. It is more likely there are several genes that interact with non-genetic factors, including psychological and social influences, to determine sexual orientation. As much as people like to divide themselves into nature or nurture camps, what genes actually do in the brain reflect an interaction between hereditary, genetic, and environmental information. So, as we see that it's really much more complex than expected, and but I always wonder, why do we put so much emphasis upon this? Why is it that we always want to try to figure out what causes homosexuality? Even within the church, not just outside the church. I can understand why outside the church they put so much emphasis on this, because they think if we can prove that it's genetic or biological, then we can prove that it's morally permissible. So that I can understand. But within the church, we seem to put all this emphasis upon trying to figure out, it must be how you're raised, or it must be something that happened when you were younger, or it must be when you were maybe abused as a kid. But the problem with that is, why don't we put any emphasis upon finding the cause of gossip? Why don't we put, any emphasis upon looking for the cause of pornography, or pride, or adultery? Because when we just put so much emphasis upon homosexuality, we seem to then lift up homosexuality to be one of the worst sins. And I don't think that it is. It is a sin, but it's like any other sin. But in addition, when we put so much emphasis upon it, I think it's based upon a faulty premise. And what's that premise? That premise is, if we can find the cause, then we can somehow find the cure. So if we can try to figure out, it must be how you're raised, well then, if we can take care of your pain here, of how you're raised, then we can take care of your homosexuality. But can we do that? Because if we really think that we can do that, I think that's based more upon a Freudian ideology that doesn't really come in line with biblical teachings of humanity, and it kind of shifts responsibility away from us and onto someone else. Because ultimately, the main problem, it's a spiritual problem. And if it's a spiritual problem, if homosexuality is a spiritual problem or a spiritual issue, then guess what? We need a spiritual answer. If you have a spiritual problem, then the answer has to be spiritual, and therefore, our answer has to be Christ. Our answer has to be the gospel. Paul says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. We need to be crucified with Christ. We no longer live, but Christ lives in us. So the most important thing that we need to remember in all of this, that really ultimately, I don't think we can ever really find the main cause of homosexuality other than the fact that it is part of our sinful nature, and the answer, therefore, is Christ. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the gift of life. We praise you for Jesus, who is the answer, not just on the issue of homosexuality, but is the answer to all of our struggles, all of our problems. Father, I pray that as we interact with those in our community, that we wouldn't get caught up in the arguments and effects and debates, but Lord, that we would come back to the gospel, and the only way that we can bring any type of change is really showing that above all else, Jesus is Lord. Father, we praise you, we thank you, and we ask this in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Again, we give thanks for Christopher. And thank you for your coming. So, hope you see you this afternoon, this evening, 7 o'clock at Hurl Center, and then maybe tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock at Face Value. Thank you.